It was a sweltering summer night, one that would burn itself into my memory for the rest of my life. I was just a boy then, no older than 8 or 9, and the heat in my room was suffocating. Sweat clung to my skin as I woke abruptly, the darkness around me thick and oppressive. My chest tightened with a familiar fear, the kind that only comes when you're alone in the dark and you're too young to convince yourself there's nothing lurking in the shadows. I was terrified of sleeping alone. That fear had always felt irrational, but that night, it became horrifyingly real. I knew what I had to do, go to my parents' bedroom where safety awaited. But as I pulled back the covers and put my feet on the creaking wooden floor, something in the air shifted. It was heavier, colder, as if the very night was warning me not to leave my room. My door opened with a faint groan, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness of the house. The hallway stretched out before me, bathed in an eerie glow from the streetlights outside. It wasn't the soft, comforting light I'd seen countless times before. No, this was something entirely different. The light seemed almost alive, spilling through the windows with an intensity that painted every surface in sharp, unnatural contrasts. Shadows danced where they shouldn't, flickering in ways that defied logic. My heart pounded as I stepped into the hallway, every creak of the floorboards beneath me sending shivers down my spine. My destination was clear, my parents' room, just down the hall to the right, past the staircase that led to the first floor. But as I took those cautious steps forward, something caught my eye. At the base of the stairs, in the darkest corner where the light barely reached, was a silhouette. It was blacker than the shadows around it, an absence of light that seemed to drink in the glow from the windows. The shape was unnervingly familiar, broad shoulders, the height, even the slight tilt of the head. For a fleeting moment, I thought it was my father. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. Something was wrong. My father would never just stand there, silent and motionless, in the middle of the night. My breath caught in my throat, and I whispered, "Dad?" The word hung in the air, swallowed by the oppressive silence. There was no response. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me in any way. The longer I stared, the more I realized how wrong it was. The edges of the silhouette seemed too sharp, too defined, as if it didn't belong in this world. And then, as if it had been waiting for me to notice, it moved. Not like a person walking, no. It floated. Slowly, deliberately, it began to ascend the stairs, gliding up each step without making a sound. My body locked in place, paralyzed by the impossibility of what I was seeing. My mind screamed at me to run, to get to my parents' room, but my feet wouldn't obey. I could only watch as the figure grew closer, its inhuman movement defying everything I knew to be true. In that moment, the fear wasn't just in my mind. It was physical, crawling under my skin and settling deep in my bones. The air felt heavier with every second, as if the house itself was holding its breath. And then I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible hum, coming from the figure as it ascended. It wasn't mechanical, nor was it human. It was a sound I can only describe as wrong. My instincts finally broke through the paralysis, and I turned on my heel, bolting for my parents' room. My feet barely touched the ground as I threw myself at their door, flinging it open and slamming it shut behind me. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it, the presence, the weight of its gaze, as if it was watching me even through the door. As I dove onto the foot of their bed, trembling and desperate for the safety I hoped would be there, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever I had just seen, it wasn't my father. It wasn't human, and somehow it knew I was there. The house, an ordinary suburban home by day, seemed to transform at night. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the walls, and the wooden floors creaked as though they carried memories of the past. That summer night, the oppressive heat was the first sign that something was wrong. It wasn't just the sticky, sweltering discomfort typical of July. This was different. The air in my room felt thick, almost alive, pressing down on me like an unseen force. Even the hum of the fan in the corner, usually a comforting rhythm, sounded distorted and distant, as if muffled by something unseen. Every instinct told me to stay under the covers, but the sweltering heat was unbearable. I had to move. When I opened my bedroom door, the hallway ahead was bathed in a glow I couldn't comprehend. The streetlights outside had always been faint, a soft orange that barely illuminated the edges of the corridor. But tonight, the light was blinding, spilling in like a flood and drowning everything in its eerie luminescence. It wasn't natural. The light didn't just illuminate, it seemed to distort, casting sharp, jagged shadows that moved even when nothing else did. The edges of the shadows flickered, like flames, dancing to a rhythm I couldn't hear. My stomach churned as I stepped into the hallway, the faint scent of something burnt. Wood? Rubber? Wafting through the air. The stairs leading to the first floor had always been silent guardians of the house, their polished wood gleaming faintly in the light. But that night, they seemed to breathe. Each step looked darker than the last, as though something was seeping into the wood, staining it with an unnatural blackness. The air around the stairs felt colder, sharper, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. It was as if the staircase itself had become a portal to something darker, something far beyond my understanding. My parents' room was to the right of the stairs, just a few steps away, but the distance felt insurmountable. My legs grew heavy as if wading through invisible molasses, every step a monumental effort. As I moved closer, the hallway began to change. The light warped, bending around corners it shouldn't, pooling in places that should have been dark. My reflection in the glass of a picture frame on the wall caught my eye, and my heart stopped. It wasn't my reflection at all. The figure staring back at me was distorted, its features stretched and blurred like a face pressed against a sheet of plastic. Its mouth hung open in a silent scream, and its eyes were empty, hollow voids that seemed to pull me in. I blinked, and the figure vanished, replaced by my own wide-eyed, terrified face. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the walls around me seeming to close in. The door to my parents' room was just ahead, but something held me back. The silence was no longer comforting. It was oppressive, suffocating, as though the house itself had stopped breathing, waiting for something to happen. The light in the hallway flickered once, twice, and then dimmed just enough to plunge the staircase into complete darkness. And that's when I saw it. At the base of the stairs, in the deepest shadow, was a figure. Motionless, blacker than the darkness surrounding it, as if it were carved out of the void itself. It didn't belong there. It didn't belong anywhere. And yet, it was there watching me. My throat tightened as I tried to speak, but my voice came out as a hoarse whisper. "Dad!" The word barely left my lips before the silence swallowed it whole. The figure didn't respond, didn't move, but its presence grew heavier, more suffocating, as though it was pulling the very air from my lungs. The walls around the stairs seemed to shimmer, the shadows writhing like living things, and the light that had once dominated the hallway now felt like a distant memory. I was frozen, caught in the unrelenting gaze of something I couldn't see, but could feel in every fiber of my being. In that moment, I knew this wasn't just fear. This was something else entirely, something ancient, something malevolent. The house, the light, the shadows, everything had become part of it, and it was waiting for me to make the next move. As I stood frozen in the hallway, the oppressive silence was broken by the faintest sound, so soft at first, I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. It was a whisper, just barely audible, but it didn't come from the stairs or the figure at the base. No, it came from all around me. A low, fragmented murmur that seemed to seep through the walls, the floors, and the very air. The voice wasn't clear. Its words were distorted, like a radio signal struggling to find its frequency. It carried no language I could recognize, only a chilling cadence that felt like a warning, or perhaps a call. My pulse thundered in my ears as I tried to make sense of the impossible. Was it the house itself speaking to me? Or something else, something that had been waiting for this very moment? I took an instinctive step backward, my heel brushing against the wooden floor with a faint creak that echoed unnaturally loud. The figure at the base of the stairs remained still, its silhouette impossibly black against the dim light. And then, without a sound, it moved. It didn't step, didn't shift. It simply began to rise, as though lifted by invisible hands. Each moment of its ascent was deliberate, excruciatingly slow, as if it wanted me to see, to feel the weight of its presence with every second. My legs trembled, the primal urge to flee battling against the paralyzing grip of terror. I wanted to scream, but the air in my lungs was gone, stolen by the suffocating dread that wrapped around me like a shroud. Just as the figure reached the midpoint of the staircase, the whispers intensified. They overlapped, growing louder and more frantic, like a chorus of voices trapped behind an invisible barrier, desperate to be heard. My head throbbed with the sound, my vision blurring as the walls around me seemed to pulse in time with the voices. Then came the first crack, a sharp, splintering noise from the banister of the staircase. My gaze snapped to it, and I saw the wood begin to split, as though something unseen was pressing against it from the other side. The crack spread like veins, and with each new fissure, the air grew colder, sharper, biting at my skin like icy needles. I turned my head instinctively toward my parents' door, now just a few steps away. It felt like salvation, a barrier between me and whatever malevolence had seeped into this house. But as I took a step forward, a sudden rush of wind swept through the hallway. It wasn't natural. It carried no cool relief from the summer heat. Instead, it was icy and filled with the faint scent of something rotting. The lights flickered violently, casting the hallway into a strobe of shadows that danced and twisted in impossible shapes. For a brief moment, I thought I saw faces in the flickering light, contorted in expressions of anguish and rage, their mouths wide open as if screaming silently. I blinked, and they were gone, but the whispers remained, louder now, almost deafening. Then I felt it, a shift in the atmosphere, so palpable it was like a hand pressing against my chest. The figure on the stairs stopped mid-ascent. It didn't turn its head, didn't move in any way that suggested acknowledgement. And yet, I knew it had noticed me. A primal, gut-wrenching certainty gripped me. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel them, boring into me with an intensity that seemed to strip away every layer of logic and safety I had ever known. My skin crawled as a faint vibration rippled through the floor beneath me, each pulse growing stronger, as though the very house was alive and responding to the presence of this entity. In a desperate attempt to break free from the spell of terror, I opened my mouth and called out again, louder this time, "Dad?" The word shattered the whispers like glass, the sudden silence even more oppressive than the noise had been. The figure moved again, its ascent resuming, but this time faster, its form blurring slightly with each motion. It wasn't climbing anymore, it was gliding, closing the distance between us with terrifying speed. My feet finally obeyed the primal instinct to run. I bolted toward my parents' door, my heart pounding so violently I thought it might burst. The air around me grew colder with every step, as if the entity was right behind me, its presence nipping at my heels. As I reached the door, I could swear I felt something graze the back of my neck. Not a hand, but an icy breath that sent every nerve in my body into overdrive. I slammed the door shut with trembling hands, throwing myself onto the floor beside my parents' bed. The whispers were gone, the hallway was silent, but the cold remained, seeping through the wood of the door like a warning. I didn't dare move. My ears strained to catch any sound, any hint of movement outside. And then, just as I thought I could breathe again, I heard it. A faint, deliberate tap, tap, tap against the door. It was there, waiting. My body trembled as I pressed my back against the door of my parents' room, every fiber of my being urging me to stay still and quiet. But the tapping continued, slow and deliberate, as though whatever was outside wanted me to know it was still there. The sound echoed unnaturally in the silence, each tap like a nail driving into my sanity. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. Instead, it grew louder, more insistent, as if the thing on the other side was losing patience. My breath came in shallow gasps, the cold air around me clawing at my skin. I had no explanation for what I'd seen or heard, but one thing was clear. This wasn't a nightmare. It was real. I turned my head slowly toward my parents' bed, desperate for reassurance, but the sight only deepened my terror. They were there, lying peacefully, untouched by the chaos unfolding just a few feet away. How could they sleep through this? The thought clawed at my mind, unraveling any sense of normalcy. I wanted to wake them, to scream and shake them until they saw what I had seen. But something stopped me, a primal instinct, deeper than logic. A voice in the back of my mind whispered that if I woke them, I would draw the thing's attention to all of us. And I couldn't bear the thought of what it might do. The tapping stopped suddenly, plunging the room into an unbearable silence. My ears strained to pick up any sound, any movement, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. The absence of noise was worse than the tapping. It felt like the moment before a predator strikes, the stillness that comes before the storm. Then I heard it, a faint creak, the sound of weight shifting on the floorboards just beyond the door. My chest tightened as the realization hit me. It hadn't left. It was still there waiting, watching. And then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. My stomach dropped as I watched the brass handle twist, the motion slow and deliberate. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as panic surged through me. I scrambled backward on the floor, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The door didn't open all the way. It stopped just a crack, a sliver of darkness spilling into the room. I stared at the opening, half expecting to see an eye peering through, but there was nothing. Just blackness. And yet, I felt it, the overwhelming sense of being watched, of something just beyond that crack, waiting for me to make a move. A part of me wanted to scream, to wake my parents, to shatter the suffocating silence. But another part, the part governed by raw, animal instinct, knew that making a sound could be a fatal mistake. My mind raced with options, each one more desperate than the last. Should I hide? Should I try to run? Or should I confront whatever was out there, even though the thought of facing it sent icy tendrils of fear through my veins? My hands gripped the edge of the bed as I tried to steady myself, my body torn between fight and flight. And then, as if sensing my hesitation, the door creaked open wider. Just a fraction, but enough to send a fresh wave of terror crashing over me. The darkness beyond the door seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly, like something was moving within it. I thought of the figure on the stairs, its impossible movements, the way it had glided toward me without sound. Was it the same thing? Or was this something else entirely? My mind screamed for answers, but none came. All I had was the cold, suffocating certainty that whatever was out there wasn't human. And it wanted me. With trembling hands, I reached for the blanket on the bed, pulling it over myself like a shield. It was a futile gesture, I knew that. A piece of fabric wouldn't protect me from what was outside, but it was all I had. I closed my eyes tightly, my breath hitching as I tried to block out the sound of the creaking door. But then I heard it, a low, guttural whisper so close it felt like it was right next to my ear. The words were unintelligible, a harsh, guttural sound that scraped against my sanity. My body went rigid, every muscle locked in place as the whisper grew louder, filling the room with its alien cadence. In that moment, I knew I had to decide. I could stay frozen, hoping the thing would lose interest and leave, though every instinct told me it wouldn't. Or I could run, make a desperate dash for the door and try to escape, even though I had no idea what lay beyond it. My heart thundered in my chest as I weighed the impossible options. And then, with a deep, shuddering breath, I made my choice. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I turned toward the door, ready to confront whatever waited on the other side. But as I moved, the whisper stopped, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped spinning. And in that silence, I felt it. The presence. It wasn't outside the door anymore. It was inside the room. The silence was oppressive, heavier than anything I had ever felt before. It wrapped itself around me like a suffocating blanket, thick and impenetrable. I couldn't hear my parents breathing anymore. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. My instincts screamed at me to run, but to where? Whatever it wasn't outside the door anymore. It was here inside the room, and I could feel it. The air had changed. It was colder, denser, pressing against my skin like icy fingers. My body trembled uncontrollably, every nerve screaming in primal terror. Something was watching me, I was sure of it, watching and waiting. I dared not move, barely even breathed, hoping that if I stayed perfectly still it wouldn't notice me. But the presence was undeniable. It wasn't just in the room, it was everywhere. It filled the space, seeping into the walls, the floor, the very air. And then a sound broke the silence, a soft, almost imperceptible creak, as if someone or something had shifted its weight. My heart pounded in my chest, so loud it felt like it would betray me. I tightened my grip on the blanket, as though it were a shield, even though I knew it wouldn't protect me from whatever was here. Suddenly, a shadow moved in the corner of my vision. My eyes darted toward it, and my stomach churned with a mix of terror and disbelief. At first, I thought it was just the play of light and shadow, a trick of my mind in the dim room. But then it moved again, deliberate and fluid, separating itself from the darkness. It wasn't a shadow at all. It was something tall and unnaturally thin, its shape shifting as though it were made of smoke, but with a solidity that defied logic. It stood in the far corner of the room, unmoving yet alive with an energy that made my skin crawl. My throat tightened as I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body felt paralyzed, frozen in place by a fear so visceral it rooted me to the spot. The figure didn't have a face, not in the way we understand one, but there were hollows where eyes should have been, deep, empty voids that seemed to suck in the faint light of the room. They weren't just dark, they were nothingness, and they stared directly at me. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. It was as if those voids had trapped me, pulling me into their infinite darkness. And then it began to move. It didn't walk, didn't glide like before. It simply shifted, as though the space between us bent to its will. One moment it was in the corner, and the next it was closer, its form looming over me. The cold intensified, biting into my skin like a winter wind. My breaths came in short, shallow gasps, and I felt my chest tighten as panic took over. I tried to crawl backward, but the bed was behind me, leaving me no escape. The figure tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion that felt mocking, almost curious, as though it were studying me. Without warning, the whispers returned, louder and more distinct than before. They came from the figure, but also from everywhere at once. Words, fragmented and alien, filled the room, echoing in my mind as much as in my ears. The sound was unbearable, a chorus of voices layered on top of each other, some pleading, others laughing, and others screaming in agony. My hands flew to my ears, trying to block them out, but it was futile. The whispers weren't just sounds, they were inside me, twisting through my thoughts, unraveling my sense of reality. My vision blurred as tears streamed down my face, my body shaking violently. Then the figure reached out. Its hand, if you could call it that, was long and skeletal, its fingers stretching impossibly far, almost like tendrils of smoke solidified into claws. It didn't touch me, not physically, but the moment it extended toward me, I felt a wave of icy pain ripple through my body. It was like every nerve was being exposed, raw and burning, though no wound was visible. My head spun, my thoughts fragmenting into a haze of fear and confusion. I could feel its presence inside my mind, probing, searching for something I couldn't understand. And then, just as I thought I would lose myself completely, it stopped. The whispers ceased, the cold began to lift, and the figure retracted its hand. It stood there for a moment longer, its void-like eyes locked onto mine, as if it had found whatever it was looking for. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room felt empty again, the oppressive weight lifted, but the terror lingered, etched into every corner of my mind. I stayed where I was, curled up against the bed, too afraid to move or make a sound. I didn't know what it was or why it had come, but one thing was certain, it wasn't over. It would come back. The silence that followed the figure's disappearance was deafening, almost surreal. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my ears still ringing from the cacophony of whispers that had consumed the room moments before. The air felt heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness, as though the world itself had paused. My limbs trembled uncontrollably, every muscle locked in a state of tension, as if bracing for whatever might come next. I wanted to believe it was over, that the figure was gone, but deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't an ending. It was merely the calm before something far worse. As I slowly uncurled myself from the floor, my eyes scanned the room for any sign of movement. Shadows clung stubbornly to the corners, darker than they should have been, refusing to yield to the faint glow of moonlight spilling through the window. The temperature hadn't returned to normal, the cold lingered, seeping into my bones, a stark reminder of what had just transpired. I turned my head toward the door, now fully shut, and saw something that made my breath hitch. The doorknob was scorched, the metal warped and blackened as though it had been touched by something impossibly hot. Yet the air around me remained icy. How could both sensations exist in the same space? Gathering what little courage I had left, I reached out to touch the bed frame, grounding myself in the solidness of the world. My parents were still asleep, unmoving, their breaths shallow and rhythmic. But something about them seemed wrong. It wasn't just their unnerving stillness, it was the unnatural paleness of their faces, as though all color had been drained. I called out to them in a shaky whisper, "Mom? Dad?" But they didn't stir. Panic surged in my chest as I reached out to shake my father's shoulder, but the moment my hand made contact, I recoiled. His skin was ice cold, almost lifeless, yet his chest rose and fell as if he were in a deep sleep. My mind raced with questions. Were they under the same spell as the house? Had the figure done something to them? As I tried to make sense of the impossibility, a sound broke the silence, a faint, rhythmic creak coming from the hallway. My heart sank as I realized it was the same sound I had heard earlier, the creaking of the stairs. Slowly, I turned my gaze toward the door. Though the figure had vanished, its presence hadn't left. I could feel it, a malignant force pressing against the door as if testing its strength. My legs felt like lead, but something compelled me to move, to uncover the truth behind the terror that had invaded my home. Against every instinct screaming for me to stay, I took a step toward the door. My fingers hovered over the scorched doorknob, the warped metal radiating a strange, unnatural heat. Summoning every ounce of resolve, I turned it and pulled the door open, the hinges groaning like a dying breath. The hallway beyond was shrouded in darkness, the streetlights outside dimmed to an unnatural glow, as if the shadows had devoured their light. The air was colder now, biting against my skin, and the creaking sound had stopped. The silence was worse. It was oppressive, suffocating, as though the house itself was holding its breath. As I stepped into the hallway, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. At the base of the stairs, where the figure had first appeared, there were marks on the floor. They weren't scratches or scuffs, but something deeper, more deliberate. Symbols etched into the wood, their edges glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. I didn't recognize them, but they pulsed faintly, like they were alive. A sense of dread washed over me as I realized these markings weren't random. They were purposeful, as if someone or something had left them as a message or a warning. My gaze shifted to the top of the stairs, where the darkness was thickest, almost impenetrable. I could feel the pull of it, an invisible force urging me forward. It wasn't curiosity that drove me. It was something deeper, a compulsion I couldn't resist. My feet moved on their own, carrying me up the steps one by one, each creak echoing louder than the last. As I reached the top, the air grew impossibly cold, each breath forming visible clouds in the darkness. The shadows seemed to writhe, shifting like living things, and at the end of the hallway I saw it. The figure. It was different now. Its form was clearer, more defined, yet still impossibly dark, as if it absorbed every particle of light around it. In its hand, it held something, a small object that glinted faintly in the dim light. I couldn't make out what it was, but it seemed familiar, almost personal. The figure raised it slowly, as though presenting it to me, and the moment I saw it, my blood turned to ice. It was a photograph. My photograph. The image showed me as a child, standing in the very hallway where I now stood, but the scene was different. In the photo, the figure was behind me, its void-like eyes staring straight at the camera. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the floor, the realization crashing over me like a tidal wave. This thing, this entity, hadn't just appeared tonight. It had been watching me for years, waiting for this moment. The photograph was proof, a cruel reminder that my life had never been my own. My hands shook as I clutched my chest, trying to steady my breathing, but the figure began to move, stepping closer with each passing second. The whispers returned, louder and more fragmented, filling my mind with a cacophony of incomprehensible voices. And then, just as the figure reached out to me, everything went black. When I woke, it was morning. The hallway was empty, the air warm and still. My parents were awake, cheerful as though nothing had happened. But I knew the truth. The figure wasn't gone. It was still watching, waiting. And it would return. The morning sun spilled through the windows, bathing the hallway in a golden light that should have been comforting. But for me, it brought no solace. My body ached as if I had run a marathon, my mind foggy and distant. The events of the night replayed in my head like a broken record, each detail sharper than the last. The figure, the whispers, the photograph. It wasn't just fear that gripped me now. It was the haunting realization that I was no longer alone. Whatever that thing was, it had marked me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching. My parents moved around the house as though nothing had happened. They smiled and laughed, oblivious to the horrors that had unfolded while they slept. I wanted to tell them, to scream and demand they believe me, but the words caught in my throat. What could I even say? That I had seen a shadow climb the stairs, that I had felt it in the room with me, that it had shown me a photograph of my own childhood with it lurking behind me? They would never believe me. No one would. And so I stayed silent, my fear a prison I couldn't escape. As the day wore on, the house felt different. The warmth of the sun couldn't dispel the cold that lingered in the corners, the faint whispers that seemed to echo just out of earshot. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the walls, moving ever so slightly when no one was looking. I found myself avoiding the hallway, the stairs, and especially the corner where the figure had first appeared. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift in the light, sent my heart racing. The house was no longer my home. It was a cage, and the thing inside it was still there, lurking in the unseen. I spent the afternoon searching for the photograph, desperate to prove to myself that it was real. My hands trembled as I rummaged through drawers and boxes, my breathing shallow with anticipation. But it was nowhere to be found. It was as if it had never existed, as if the figure had taken it with it when it vanished. The absence of the photo only deepened my dread. If it wasn't real, then what was? Had my mind fabricated the entire night? Or was the figure taunting me, erasing the evidence to make me doubt my own sanity? That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house fell into darkness once more, my fear returned tenfold. I locked my bedroom door, barricading it with whatever furniture I could move, but it did little to ease my terror. The whispers started again, faint at first, like a breeze rustling through leaves. But they grew louder as the night wore on, the disjointed voices overlapping in a maddening cacophony. I covered my ears with my hands, tears streaming down my face as I begged for it to stop. But the whispers weren't just in the air. They were in my head, twisting and pulling at my thoughts, filling every corner of my mind with their alien cadence. Then I felt it again, the cold. It seeped into the room like an unwelcome guest, wrapping around me and stealing the warmth from my skin. I didn't need to look to know it was there. The presence was undeniable, a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. My heart pounded as I forced myself to open my eyes, scanning the room for any sign of movement. And then, in the faint glow of moonlight, I saw it. The shadow was back, standing in the corner of my room, darker than the darkness itself. This time it didn't move. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to paralyze me, to strip away any sense of safety I had left. Its void-like eyes bore into mine, pulling me into their endless blackness. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body refused to move, locked in place by an invisible force. And then the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, heavier than any sound I had ever heard. It was as if the world had stopped spinning, as if time itself had paused. The figure raised its hand again, just as it had the night before. But this time it pointed directly at me. My breath hitched as a new sound filled the room, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something far worse, a sound that reverberated through my very soul. My vision blurred as the darkness around the figure began to spread, creeping along the walls and floor like a living thing. It consumed everything in its path, and I knew, with a horrifying certainty, that it was coming for me. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was gone. The figure, the darkness, the cold, everything vanished, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence of my room. My body shook uncontrollably, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. But there were no answers, only the lingering terror that this was far from over. I knew it would return, and when it did, I might not survive. The following morning, I packed my things and left the house, unable to bear another night under its roof. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me. That no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, the figure would follow. Because it wasn't tied to the house. It was tied to me, and I knew deep down that I would never escape it. The days that followed were a blur of fear and confusion. I left the house, abandoning everything I couldn't carry in a single bag, desperate to escape whatever malevolent force had invaded my life. Yet, even as I drove away, the sense of unease never left me. The road stretched endlessly before me, but every shadow cast by the setting sun seemed darker, every movement in the corner of my eye more sinister. It wasn't the house that was haunted, it was me. I was certain of it now. Wherever I went, the figure would follow, its presence etched into my very being like a curse. The first night in the motel was agonizing. I had chosen a place far from the house, miles away in a quiet, unassuming town. The room was small but felt safe, at least at first. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and the hum of the air conditioner filled the silence. But as midnight approached, the familiar dread began to creep in. The air grew colder, heavier, and that suffocating stillness returned. I sat on the edge of the bed, gripping the blankets tightly as I watched the shadows in the corners of the room stretch and shift. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely. My heart raced as darkness swallowed the room, my only source of light now the faint glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. And then I heard it, the whispers. They started faintly, barely audible, like the rustling of leaves on a windless night. But soon they grew louder, overlapping in a maddening chorus of fragmented voices. Some cried, others laughed, and some spoke in harsh, guttural tones that made my skin crawl. They were all around me, filling the room with their chaotic symphony, but I couldn't make out a single word. It wasn't language, it was pure malice. I turned toward the window, desperate for some sign of the outside world, some reassurance that I wasn't entirely alone. But as I pulled back the curtain, my breath caught in my throat. There, standing just beyond the glass, was the figure. Its void-like eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was overwhelming, a force that seeped into my mind and body, paralyzing me with fear. I stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the bed, my heart pounding so violently I thought it might stop. As I hit the floor, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was more oppressive than the noise, a void that seemed to suck the air from the room. And then I felt it, the cold, sharp and invasive, wrapping around me like a vice. My vision blurred as the edges of the room began to distort, the shadows twisting and writhing like living things. The figure was inside now, standing at the foot of the bed, its impossible form darker than the blackness surrounding it. My body refused to move, locked in place by an unseen force. As the figure slowly leaned forward, its presence looming over me. I don't remember falling unconscious, but when I woke, it was morning. The sunlight streamed through the curtains, warm and inviting, but it felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. My body was drenched in sweat, my limbs heavy and unresponsive. The whispers were gone, the figure nowhere to be seen, but the sense of dread remained. I glanced at the mirror on the wall and froze. On the glass, written in faint, uneven strokes, were the words, "You cannot run." My blood ran cold as the reality of my situation sank in. This wasn't over. It would never be over. I tried to piece together the events of the past few days, to make sense of the impossible, but the memories were fragmented, like shards of broken glass. The figure had been with me for longer than I realized, lurking in the shadows of my life, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Why had it chosen me? What did it want? The questions swirled endlessly in my mind, but the answers eluded me. All I knew was that I was trapped, bound to this entity in ways I couldn't understand. In the weeks that followed, I moved from place to place, never staying in one spot for more than a few nights. But no matter how far I ran, the figure always found me. It didn't appear every night, but its presence was constant, lingering in the corners of my vision, in the cold spots that seemed to follow me everywhere. I stopped telling people about it. No one believed me, and their disbelief only deepened my isolation. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a curse, one that had no end. Even now, as I write this, I can feel it. The air around me is growing colder, the light from the lamp on my desk dimming ever so slightly. The whispers are faint, but they're there, waiting to grow louder. I don't know how much time I have left before it comes again, but I had to tell my story. Maybe someone out there will understand, will believe me. Or maybe, like me, they'll realize too late that some things can't be escaped. And so, I wait, knowing that the figure is always watching, always waiting. I don't know what it wants, but one thing is certain. It won't stop until it has taken everything from me. And perhaps, in the end, that's the scariest part of all. Not the figure itself, but the knowledge that there's nothing I can do to stop it.